Picture this. It's October 1927. The leaves are turning gold in Central Park. And on Fifth Avenue, something unprecedented is happening. Thousands of New Yorkers are standing in line, not for bread, not for work, but to walk through a palace that will be demolished in exactly 7 days. They're paying 50 cents each for one last glimpse of the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, the largest private residence ever built in Manhattan. 137 rooms of limestone and marble that took nearly a decade to complete, and would take less than 3 months to tear down. The question isn't why they're tearing it down. The question is how an entire street of American palaces, the greatest concentration of private wealth ever assembled, could vanish almost overnight. This is Fifth Avenue. For 50 years, from the 1870s to the 1920s, it was quite simply the most expensive street on earth. They called it Millionaire's Row, though that undersells it. These weren't millionaires. These were the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Fricks. The families who didn't just have money, they were money. You've heard their stories before. Mrs. Astor's ballroom that could hold exactly 400. The Vanderbilt dynasty that controlled more wealth than the U.S. Treasury. The Frick mansion that became a monument to both art and blood. But here's what they don't tell you. Between 1920 and 1940, over 80% of these mansions disappeared. Not gradually, not gracefully. They fell like dominoes, one after another, replaced by something their builders could never have imagined. This isn't just about old buildings making way for new ones. This is about how modern architecture didn't simply replace the Gilded Age, it executed it. And the weapon wasn't a wrecking ball. It was an elevator. If you enjoy these deep dives into architecture's hidden stories, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps. Now, let's walk down a street that no longer exists. To understand what we lost, you need to see what was there. Fifth Avenue in 1900. Imagine walking north from 34th Street. Not the Macy's and retail towers you know today, but something that contemporary visitors called more magnificent than the Champs-Élysées. Every block between 50th and 90th Street was lined with mansions. Not houses, not even estates. These were urban palaces, built to a scale that defied logic. The numbers alone tell a story of excess that's hard to fathom. The Vanderbilt family owned 10 separate mansions on Fifth Avenue. 10. The largest, belonging to Cornelius Vanderbilt II, stretched an entire city block. The William K. Vanderbilt Château at 52nd Street contained more imported French limestone than most actual French châteaux. The Astor mansion at 65th Street had a ballroom with a ceiling painted by European artists who spent 3 years lying on scaffolding, creating clouds that seemed to float 40 feet above the dancing below. Let that sink in for a moment. 3 years for a ceiling. But these weren't just displays of wealth. They were declarations of permanence. Each mansion was built with walls 3 feet thick, foundations that went down to bedrock. These families weren't building homes. They were building dynasties meant to last 500 years. Here's the bitter irony. Most didn't last 50. The architectural styles themselves tell you everything about these families' ambitions. French Renaissance for the Vanderbilts, because they saw themselves as American Medicis. English Gothic for the Goulds, aristocracy through architecture. Italian Palazzo for the Villards, bringing the grandeur of Rome to Madison Avenue. By 1905, Fifth Avenue contained more European marble than had been imported to America in the previous century combined. One visiting British duke reportedly said, "We have nothing like this in England. You've built Mayfair, Belgravia, and the Palace of Versailles on a single street." And then, almost overnight, it was gone. The end began with numbers. Simple mathematics. In 1900, the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion sat on land worth $2 million. By 1925, that same land was worth $18 million. The mansion generated no income. It only consumed heat, staff, maintenance. Meanwhile, a commercial building on that same footprint could generate $1 million in rent. Every year. Think of it as a blood transfusion in reverse. Every day these mansions stood, they hemorrhaged money. But the economics were just one pressure point. The real transformation was happening 60 feet below the street. In 1902, the rapid transit subway opened. Suddenly, Fifth Avenue wasn't just accessible to the carriage class. Anyone with a nickel could emerge at 59th Street. The avenue of privacy became the city's main artery. Foot traffic increased tenfold in 5 years. The Astors found omnibuses stopping outside their breakfast windows. Then came 1916, the year everything changed. New York passed its first comprehensive zoning law, not to limit buildings, but to organize them. It created something that hadn't existed before: clear commercial districts with defined purposes. Fifth Avenue was designated for business. Not explicitly, but the writing was on the wall. Or rather, it was in the elevator shafts. Because here's what killed the mansions. The Otis safety elevator, combined with steel frame construction, meant you could build up instead of out. Way up. A lot on Fifth Avenue that once held a 40-room mansion could now hold a 40-story building. Each floor could be rented. Each room generated income. The mansions weren't just inefficient, they were mathematically impossible to justify. The social pressure was equally crushing. After World War I, everything changed. The servant class evaporated. Young women who might have been ladies' maids were now working in department stores. Young men who might have been footmen were building skyscrapers. The Vanderbilt mansion needed a staff of 87 to function. By 1925, you couldn't find 8. The Jazz Age had arrived, and it had no patience for marble breakfast rooms. The new rich, and there were many, fed by the stock market boom, didn't want palaces. They wanted penthouses. They didn't want to live like European nobility. They wanted to live like Americans. Modern Americans. But the final blow was aesthetic. Suddenly, overnight it seemed, ornament became embarrassment. Those carved limestone facades, those bronze doors from Paris, those hand-painted ceilings, they weren't magnificent anymore. They were ridiculous. The coming thing was clean lines, glass and steel, efficiency as beauty. The mansions didn't age into irrelevance. They were murdered by modernity. It happened on a Tuesday. November 1st, 1927. They started at the roof. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, 137 rooms, 130,000 square feet, the largest private home ever built in Manhattan, began its transformation into rubble. But before the wrecking balls swung, something extraordinary happened. For 3 weeks in October, the Vanderbilt family opened the mansion to the public. 50 cents bought you a final tour through American royalty's greatest palace. And they came. 20,000 people in 21 days. They walked through the Moorish smoking room with its carved alabaster arches. They stood in the 2-story dining room where President Cleveland had eaten off gold plates. They climbed the grand staircase, each step a single block of marble, and entered Alice Vanderbilt's bedroom, where the furniture alone had cost more than most Manhattan townhouses. The demolition itself was a fortune. $4 million to build in 1893, $600,000 to tear down in 1927. Let that mathematics sink in. The mansion was just 43 years old, younger than many of the people watching it fall. What rose in its place tells you everything about the new Fifth Avenue. Not another mansion, not even a hotel, a department store, Bergdorf Goodman. Where Alice Vanderbilt once held court in her French salon, shoppers now bought French perfume. The transformation was complete. Private grandeur had become public commerce. But the Vanderbilt demolition was just the most dramatic domino. The same year, 1927, 6 other Fifth Avenue mansions fell. The Gould Mansion at 67th Street, the Huntington at 57th, the Brokaw Mansion, which had stood for barely 20 years, was demolished to make way for retail space. The William K. Vanderbilt Châteaux, that French Renaissance masterpiece, demolished in 1926. On its footprint rose commercial buildings generating 50 times the property tax. The Astor mansions tell an even more symbolic story. When Caroline Astor died, her son built the Waldorf Hotel on her property. His cousin, not to be outdone, built the Astoria next door. They connected them with a corridor called Peacock Alley. The Waldorf Astoria became the world's most famous hotel, built literally on the bones of Mrs. Astor's social empire. And then, here's the brutal poetry. The Waldorf Astoria itself was demolished. May 3rd, 1929. In its place rose something that made even skyscrapers look small. The Empire State Building. From Astor Ballroom to the tallest building in the world in just 35 years. The speed defies belief. Between 1912 and 1930, Fifth Avenue north of 42nd Street went from 90% residential to 90% commercial. No other street in history has transformed so completely, so quickly. But destruction is only half the story. What rose from the rubble wasn't just buildings. It was a new American identity. 1928. John D. Rockefeller Jr. stands at 5th Avenue and 50th Street, looking at 12 square blocks of brownstones and speakeasies. Where others see a neighborhood, he sees a blank canvas. What he builds there will become the manifesto of modern America. Rockefeller Center. The numbers are staggering. 228 buildings demolished, 4,000 residents relocated, 75,000 construction workers employed during the Depression, when 1 in 4 Americans had no job. But Rockefeller Center wasn't really about numbers. It was about announcing that America had its own architecture. Not borrowed European facades, not imported Renaissance details. This was Art Deco streamlined into something entirely new. The RCA building, now 30 Rock, rose 70 stories of Indiana limestone that caught the light like no Fifth Avenue mansion ever could. Here's what made it revolutionary. It was beautiful without ornament, powerful without pillars. It drew its drama from mass and light, not from carved marble goddesses. The architects, Raymond Hood, Wallace Harrison, they understood something the mansion builders never grasped. Modern power didn't need to hide behind palace walls. It wanted to be seen. Those weren't just windows, they were eyes looking out over a city being born. The international style was taking hold. Less wasn't just more. Less was everything. When Philip Johnson designed the Seagram building in 1958, he created a black glass monument to corporate power that made every mansion that ever stood look like a child's dollhouse. The aesthetic shift was violent in its completeness. Where Gilded Age architecture said, "Look at my French craftsman," modern architecture said, "Look at my American steel." Where the mansions hoarded space behind walls, skyscrapers shared it in public plazas. Where the old buildings decorated every surface, the new ones made surfaces disappear entirely into sheets of glass that reflected the city back at itself. But here's the deeper transformation. The mansions were about individual dynasties. The Vanderbilt name carved in stone. The Astor coat of arms above the door. These modern buildings, they were about corporate identity. IBM, RCA, General Motors. The new American aristocracy didn't have bloodlines. It had stock prices. The speed of change was breathtaking. The Lever House, built in 1952, where a Gould mansion once stood, was just a glass box. But that glass box became more influential than all the Beaux-Arts palaces combined. Within a decade, every major city in America was trying to build its own version. Modern architecture didn't just replace the mansions. It made them impossible to remember. By 1960, most New Yorkers couldn't imagine Fifth Avenue had ever looked different. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find them. Ghosts. The Frick Collection at 70th Street, Henry Clay Frick's mansion turned museum. 106 years old and still the most beautiful building on Fifth Avenue. Walk through its garden court and you can almost hear the world that vanished. Almost. The Carnegie Mansion at 91st Street, now the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. Andrew Carnegie built it in 1902, deliberately far uptown, hoping to escape the commercial tide. The tide found him anyway, but the mansion survived by becoming what its neighbors couldn't: useful. The Payne Whitney House at 79th Street, now the Cultural Services of the French Embassy. Stanford White's last masterpiece. It survived because France bought it, and even New York developers think twice before demolishing a foreign embassy. 3, maybe 4 if you count the Kahn Mansion, now a school. Out of 78 Gilded Age mansions that once lined Fifth Avenue, that's all that remains. The survival rate wasn't even 5%. But here's what's remarkable. Walk down Fifth Avenue today, past the Apple Store where the Vanderbilts once lived, past Tiffany's where the Astors held court, past the towers of black glass and steel, and you're still walking down the most valuable street in America. The money never left. It just changed form. The irony cuts deep. Those mansion builders thought they were creating permanent monuments to family dynasties. What they actually created were temporary theaters for a single act of American history. The skyscrapers that replaced them, those monuments to corporate efficiency and modern aesthetics, they're already being torn down too. The average Manhattan skyscraper now lasts 60 years. The Vanderbilt mansion made it to 43. Nothing is permanent on Fifth Avenue except change itself. The last great Fifth Avenue mansion demolition happened in 1980. The Stuyvesant Mansion at 72nd Street. It had survived everything, the Depression, the war, the 60s. But it couldn't survive the economics of modern Manhattan. The land was worth $40 million. The mansion was worth nothing, except to the few who remembered. They tried to save it. Preservationists, historians, even some Stuyvesant descendants. But you can't fight mathematics. Where that French Renaissance palace stood, there's now a tower of glass and steel. 40 stories of multi-million-dollar apartments, whose owners have never heard of the Stuyvesants. Modern architecture didn't kill Fifth Avenue's mansions out of malice. It killed them the way the automobile killed the carriage, not through hatred, but through obsolescence. The mansions were built for a world of servants and seasons, calling cards and carriage houses. That world didn't evolve. It ended. What replaced it? Our world of elevators and efficiency, glass walls and corporate power. It wasn't better or worse. It was simply, irrevocably, relentlessly modern. But sometimes, late at night, when Fifth Avenue empties and the lights in those towers create their own constellation, you can almost see them. The ghosts of palaces that once stood here. The Vanderbilt châteaux, the Astor ballroom, Carnegie's Scottish castle. For a moment, just a moment, Fifth Avenue remembers what it was before it became what it is. Perhaps that's the real lesson. We like to think we're building for eternity. Every generation does. The Vanderbilts were certain their mansions would outlast the pyramids. The modernists were certain their glass boxes would define the future forever. But Fifth Avenue knows better. Fifth Avenue has seen empires rise and fall in the span of a single lifetime. Nothing is permanent, not even modern. Thank you for watching. Drop a comment. Which vanished mansion should I explore next? The Potter Palmer Castle in Chicago? The Clark Mansion in Montana? Or should we head west to explore what happened to San Francisco's Nob Hill palaces?